This video is going to be about the restoration of this Macintosh SE 30. I picked it up for $30, which is a great deal. However, its condition isn't amazing, so it's going to need a bit of work before I can get it working and looking like new again. Starting off, the color of the computer is incredibly yellowed, and the computer case itself is completely covered in a layer of grime and dirt, and it just doesn't look presentable yet. This color is the color the computer's supposed to be, and the entire case is just all this shade of nasty brown. It's not looking its best. So this shipped in the late 1980s as a very high-end professional computer. It could come with 1 megabyte of RAM up to 128 megabytes of RAM, which was a ridiculous amount to have in that time. Of course, they didn't make that so much later. It had a hard drive installed, and it has a super drive, floppy disk drive, so it can read 1.44 megabyte floppy disks and 800K floppy disks. And it has a 68030 processor installed on the motherboard, along with a math coprocessor. So it's got a pretty fast CPU, and it can run a lot faster than earlier compact Macs. The screen is 1-bit color, so that means it can do black and white, and the colors are either on or off, but there aren't any shades. So to get a shade of gray or something, it dithers. So it's like a cross-hatching of black and white, but there is no granularity in color. But it's very sharp, and it can look very good when it's restored. On the motherboard of the computer, there is a series of electrolytic capacitors which like to leak all over the motherboard, and they unfortunately can cause corrosion and damage to the circuits on the motherboard. So what I need to do is take the entire machine apart, then take each and every electrolytic capacitor off the motherboard, clean the motherboard, and then install brand new tantalum capacitors, which can't leak in the same manner. If I were to try turning this computer on right now, which I'm not going to do because it hasn't been serviced yet, there's almost a 100% certainty that it wouldn't work. So we're going to take this computer apart and then remove its motherboard. And after that, we can go about cleaning the plastic case, which is in dire need of a scrub, lubricating the floppy drive so that it can eject disks and read disks and work correctly, recapping the analog board, which drives the CRT screen, and the power supply, which powers the computer. Each of those have more capacitors that would need to be replaced. There's dozens of them inside this machine, and they're all dead. We're going to need to retrobreak the computer so that we can restore the original color instead of this terrible shade of brown, because that isn't, for the most part, dirt. It's a yellowing caused by bromine in the plastics. So once it's all cleaned up and recapped and restored, it should work very well. I will also replace the spinning disk hard drive inside with a modern flash counterpart called the SCSI to SD. So start off by cracking the computer open and extracting the motherboard. To open the computer up, what I'm going to do is there's 2 screws underneath here in the handle, which I have to remove, but it's kind of hard to get into there, so I have to use a screwdriver extension. And there's also 2 screws at the back top section there. So I have to remove all 4 screws and then pull top back case off. Okay, so that's it. The screws are now removed, which is good. The next step is to pull the back case off the computer, and it just lifts straight off. So I'm going to grab it with my hands and pull upwards. But before I do that, I have to remember that there's a programmer switch installed in the computer right here. And if I don't remove this first, it'll tear off inside the computer and cause a lot of problems. So I just pull on the switch, and it'll just pop right out. And I'm not going to reinstall this until I'm done working on the computer. So now that I've done that, I can just grasp the computer firmly from the back and pull upwards. And now we're inside. This is the bottom of the motherboard. This is the insulating film. Now, continuing to spin the computer around, I'll get you the shot that you've been waiting for. The inside of the Mac. So Here we have the networking card, which is an expansion, a third-party expansion made by Asante, which gives us an Ethernet port. This here is the CRT display, which it has high voltage electricity running through it when it's powered up, and is the most dangerous part of working on these compact Macs. There can be an electrical charge that builds up inside of the computer, even when it's clearly unplugged from the wall, that could shock you. So before I do anything else in the process of working on this Macintosh, what I need to do is discharge the current inside of the CRT. And that's a very easy, simple thing to do. All I do is I take a flathead screwdriver, standard screwdriver like this one, and then I get a alligator clip, and I clip it to the screwdriver. Once I've done that, I just clip the clip right on this grounding lug. I stick one hand in my back pocket, so that way the current couldn't possibly go across my heart, in the worst case scenario that is. And I just wedge it under here, under this cap, this anode cap. And there's a piece of metal inside of this anode cap that I can get the screwdriver to touch. It can be a little hard to do with only one hand, but that's the safer way to get about it. So now that they're touching, I can just push down on the clip inside, and it's discharged. So I can pull it right out of the computer, and we're done. So now the CRT is discharged and the computer is safer to work on. There's a nasty sort of goop that builds up around the rubber as it degrades. There's also a grease that Apple put on the CRT in the factory. But either way, as you can see, it sort of gets all over your hands, which isn't very nice. Alright, so now we're into the computer, the CRT is discharged, and the next step is to pull this video board off the computer, CRT. And this will make things a little bit easier to access for me. So now the video board is out, and the CRT is discharged. So just move the anode cap out of the way. Now what I'd like to do is remove this Asante network card. Right here, there seems to be a peg holding the card in. So I'm going to try pushing this peg out. There's a pin inside of the peg that I need to push. And that will release it from the case. Now that that's released, I will carefully, as I can, remove it from the computer. Now the card is removed. Now we've removed the expansion card, I'll set it aside for now and turn my attention to the rest of the things plugged into the logic board. The next thing I'm going to take out is this board that goes with the expansion card, the Ethernet card. So I can just use a standard Phillips head screwdriver and take out the 3 screws holding it in place. And I'm keeping my screws organized within an ice cube tray, because that way I can organize them by step, and that way I don't put the wrong screws in the wrong position. There's 4 things plugged into the floppy drive, hard drive, speaker, and the power/video cable. And now the motherboard will fold out of the computer. I have to lift it up until its grooves here are aligned. Comes out like this. Now there's a speaker cable which is still attached here to the motherboard, which I just have to pull out really carefully by disconnecting it from the pins here. And so that's it. We have our motherboard extracted from the Macintosh. And I will set it aside and take a look at the next step. So here we have the motherboard. Our goal now is to replace these electrolytic capacitors on the motherboard here because they have leaked everywhere and are preventing the computer from booting correctly. I need to take out each of these silver capacitors and then clip these axial capacitors, which are also electrolytic and could be replaced. And then I'm going to clean the entire board with isopropyl alcohol to remove the goop that they've leaked and messed things up with. And then, after I've done that, I will put new tantalum capacitors in their place. So the first thing I'm going to do is extract the RAM from the computer. Those are the RAM sims removed. And now I'm going to remove the ROM sim, which is located right here. And it's the same sort of clip mechanism. So I'll just pull back each clip. Perfect. So now you've seen the state of the board and how the capacitors really started leaking around these chips here, which is likely causing lots of video issues and problems with the computer if I were to try to turn it on. Now we need to remove the capacitors from the board, these electrolytic ones. Now there's a few ways to do this, and different people have different opinions about the best way to remove them. Some people like to get a soldering iron and remove the solder from the sides of the capacitor and then lift it up. Others like to use a heat gun of hot air and melt the solder and then lift them off. And others like to grab needle nose pliers, grab the capacitor, and twist it to remove the capacitor. Now, it sounds kind of harsh, a way to remove capacitors, and you'd think you could rip pads off by doing this. But the way the legs inside each capacitor are configured, it doesn't do any damage to the pads on the board. I've actually had much better success twisting them off this way than I have a soldering iron, because you're putting a lot more heat into the capacitor with a soldering iron when you heat them up like that, and that can actually cause the pads to lift in a worse way than it does to just twist the capacitors clear off the board, even though it sounds worse. So all you have to do is grab needle nose pliers and without pulling upwards, grasp onto the capacitor and twist. Now the electrolytic capacitors and the SMD form have been removed, I'm going to remove the axial electrolytic capacitor. Now you saw the SMD capacitors went out perfectly fine with the twisting technique. Now I just get some snips and snip off the leads to axial capacitors. Okay, there we have it. A decapped SE30 motherboard. Each capacitor has been carefully removed, and we can now go about cleaning and reinstalling capacitors. Stay tuned for the next video where I'll recap this SE30 and proceed with the project. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comment section down below, and if you like this video, please give it a like. Thank you!